Hi, I'm Arati. In my last group drawing session, I decided to use a limited palette. They weren't realistic colors, but they represented a mid-tone, a dark and a light, and therefore I kind of got the feeling of what I was trying to depict. I ended up using a sort of mid-grey, dark green and a peach. It kind of got me thinking about using gouache in the same colors, as well as a selection of other markers and pencils, widening the range but staying within the same colors. Later in this video, I will take you through the exact colors I've used to make my sketchbook spread, as well as 3 finished pieces. But first, let's take a look at the sketches I made in that session. The theme was drawing people in motion. These were real people, but of course, in my own way, I kind of put them as dogs. And I felt like I kind of chose colors that suited the mood, even though I was only working within grey, green and peach. It was a really interesting exercise, and of course I ran out of space at the bottom of some of the pages, so I needed to add on a little bit of paper for the legs to fit. It was a super fun session, and I will be drawing more dogs as people. So taking the spirit of the colors from this session, I decided to photograph some references to start with. There were some delicious tomatoes sitting in my fridge, and I really love the glossy feel of them. Now, this particular one has been sitting there for a little while, so I definitely need to use them soon. And they have a slightly rougher skin texture now. But I really like the tiny shape of these small tomatoes, whereas the larger ones have a slightly glossier skin because they're fresher. So I'll use that as a reference for the skin, but use the form of the small tomatoes. So I'm simply using my phone to frame a nice position with the tomatoes right in the middle on a plain white table. And I'm going to do a couple of different angles so that I have them for later. I will link all these images in the description box so you can use them too. I've got enough pictures to get the kind of sense of the shape of the tomato vine and the round tomatoes, as well as enough to decide where I want light, dark and highlights. Now these are going back in my fridge to be eaten for lunch, and let's start in my Seawhite of Brighton A4 sketchbook with a rough sketch of the kind of things that I might want to do for my final piece. I'm doing this very roughly because I'm just ideating right now, kind of emulating the feel of those reference pictures that I took, but not copying anything directly. What I'm trying to do here is get a nice layout that I can then fill in with the kind of colors I think I want to use, but then when I do the final illustrative piece, I may not actually do an exact copy of what I'm sketching. This is more for me to gain ideas, to experiment, to figure out what I want things to look like, the colors I want to use, the shapes, the lines, the kind of movement that I can get, even within a slightly tighter piece, because the final piece isn't going to be as loose as this. I'm starting out this first sketch with the pale peach, layering it as an undertone, and then I'm going to put layers on top in different colors to get the dimensionality and the 3D effect of the tomatoes, but still in an illustrative sort of way. I'm using the Tombows in the sketches, but the final artwork will be in gouache because Tombows are not, unfortunately, light fast. Now, because this is a limited palette that I'm using, I am just going to make lights and darks with the same tones of these colors. I'm just going to use peach, grey and green in order to get all the values, and no matter whether I'm using a light color as the base or a dark color as the base. Even when I do this in gouache, I will be mixing darks and lights, not with blacks and blues and other colors, but just with white and these 3 colors. It makes it a little bit more difficult to get shades and tones that you want, but that's the challenge, is to get the effect you want, but with these limited colors. Since I've started here with the lightest tone that I've got in my limited palette, it's a little bit easier to get contrast, especially with this dark green Posca pen that I'm using. It's such a difference between the lightest shade and the darkest shade that it creates an interesting effect when I get that contrast of a slightly more graphic illustration rather than a realistic one, which is what I'm going for. It's also at this stage that I am comparing and contrasting my reference images to what I'm actually doing. You'll notice that whereas I roughly scribbled the number of leaves or sepals or petals or whatever they're called on these tomatoes, because not only did the original reference picture have 5 petals, sepals, leaves, whatever, although some of the tomatoes did have 6, I noticed, but 5 is a nice odd number, and I find that odd numbered things tend to look a little bit more balanced. Even though you'd think that even numbers would look more balanced, I find that 3s, 5s, 7s seem to look better in illustrations, at least in my opinion. So that's what I've chosen to do. I've also chosen to make those leaves, I'm just going to call them leaves, please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, that they look a little bit smaller in comparison to the larger tomatoes. I may decide to change this in the final piece, make them a bit longer like they were in the original reference photos, but I think I like this for now. At this stage, I'm also working out where I want the highlights to be. Now, I'm not working out the highlights based on a particular light direction. I am making this more abstract, and I'm putting them where I want them to be based on how I perceive the roundness of the tomatoes themselves, how I want them to look, how I want the shine to be seen. Now, because I've used Posca pen, I need to wait for the acrylic paint to dry before I can do anything further on this. So I'm starting off with a second layout. I'm using a slightly more scrunched up feel like the big tomatoes were, but using the small tomato shape. I'm working out where the branches should go and what direction the tomatoes should go in. And this is where a sketchbook comes in really handy, because you can put out your thoughts in actuality without having the trouble of having to finish an entire piece and then deciding that you didn't like it anyway, which does sometimes happen, I'm not going to deny that. But here I'm starting first with the dark shades because I want it to be kind of a mid-toned piece. And even at this stage of sketching, you can see that when I'm putting in this dark color, I'm not following the pencil lines that I put down in the first place. And that's what the sketchbook really helps with, is kind of firming your ideas and deciding what you actually want to do. Even though it might change in the final piece, even here you can solidify your ideas, you can sketch, scribble, decide what you want to make, ideate basically. And that's what a sketchbook should be, really. It is for ideation, it is for experimentation, it is to solidify your ideas, it's to bring other ideas together into one place and then formulate them into your own. As Austin Kleon says, steal like an artist. Find ideas from all sorts of places, from ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary sources, and make it your own. There is nothing original in this world left. Everybody's done everything. It's just your own perspective because you are an individual and nobody can do it the way that you can do it. Which is why I'm filling this tomato with this mid-tone green. Now you'll see between the peach one and this one, there's much less contrast in this. But then that's what I want as well. There are things in this world that have less contrast and they still look equally beautiful. Now the question is, how do I add highlights in this to make that roundness of the tomato come out? But as you can see, I'm also adding the shadows in order to make that roundness appear, well, more round, to be quite simple, by layering the Tombow over itself. The real challenge here will be when I get to the final piece in gouache. How do I darken that mid-tone enough without using black in order to get a little bit of contrast, a little bit of depth in the piece. Here again, I'm using a Pitt artist's pen to add the highlights, just to plan out where they go, because I will need to wait for this to dry a little bit before I add gouache on top, because that really gives me the whitest white for the highlights that I want. I always use white in a limited palette because that's really the only way to get a lighter shade without going muddy. If I was to mix the peach into the green, it would just end up being absolute boggy muck. So adding the white, whether I choose to leave the paper white and use that as the highlight, or use actual white, permanent white gouache on top, or whether I decide to use one of my favorites, Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. That also gives you a really nice bright white, although it does tend to dry up a bit fast, so I'm not quite sure if my bottle is still active or whether I need to get a new one. But I digress. I could have a whole discussion on all the different types of whites. In fact, that might be an interesting video to make, all the whites I own, whether it's gouache or acrylic or Dr. P.H. Martin or whatever. Anyway, again, another digression. So for the third little sketch, let's do a darker color. Now on this one, I have decided to do the tomatoes first and let those decide the shape of the stems. I'm also going to define the highlights before I actually paint in the tomatoes. As I'm filling it in, I'm also using this dark Tombow pen to layer upon itself, thereby creating the dark shadows as I'm going. Whereas in the previous ones, I did it in separate layers. I'm just going all in with this one because that's how this color of pen seems to work. Now, in keeping with the darker toned theme of this third sketch, I'm still using that same dark Posca pen that I used for the first drawing with the peach, but because it's now set with a darker green, there's even less contrast. But it really suits it. It's just a darker toned piece. That's just how it works. I'm also trying to give the stems and the leaves for this one a little bit more movement than the other two. They're a bit more curved, a little less linear, and I feel like that seems to work better. I might try doing that in the final pieces. This is also the stage at which I'm experimenting with thicker or thinner lines for the stems, adding again more highlights, and just in general kind of thinking about what I want to do in the final pieces. Now that I've done 3 sketches of these tomatoes, I have a more solidified idea in my head. Coming back to that original first sketch with the peach, I'm going to add some details with pencil because that's how I work in my gouache paintings. I add a base of gouache with some color blending, and then I put details over the top and texture with colored pencils or sometimes Posca pens or other media. Since I'm working with a limited palette, the darks in this are going to be the mid-tones from the next darkest drawing, and then the mid-tones in that will be the darkest shades from the darkest drawing. The darkest drawing, I will find it slightly difficult to put really dark darks in there. Like you can see here, that darkest shade from the dark green actually really works well for shadows and for outlining the highlights to make them stand out a bit more. It just adds a third dimension to those tomatoes and works really well over that sort of kind of olivey, sap, limey green. Here in these sketches, I'm a bit freer to use different media like the Tombows and the pencils and the Poscas and everything else, but when I make original artwork, I only want to use color-fast materials that will last a very long time. Because although I do like to hoard my originals, I do also sell them, and I don't want anybody to be disappointed by them fading. I mean, I do send care instructions, but people are people and they do what they want to do. So while in this medium tomato image, I'm able to pick out the leaves with this dark Tombow, I will have to find some other way of doing that in the final piece, probably with either gouache or a really dark green pencil. I'm also adding texture with a white aquarelle pencil, and I might actually do this in the final piece both with pencil as well as on the underlying layer by mixing my permanent white gouache with whatever shade I'm using. It'll give it a little bit more 3D quality, and also I'll be able to get some color variation within the gouache without it being too flat. White works way better to lift on these darker colors as opposed to the paler peach. It's not as visible on the peach compared to these two colors. Now in this one I've already got the highlights, but again when you can see I'm adding the pencils, it just gives it a little bit more of a lift, especially where the leaves are. I can see more of the tomato underneath rather than just the shadow. Making decisions like these is easy in your head, but once you actually translate it into your sketchbook, that's when you realize, oh, this might not work, or oh, this does work, or maybe I need more of this. In this case now I'm adding a darker green because I maybe put too much white and I need to bring back the slightly shadowy areas of the tomatoes. Now this is one of the last pages in my sketchbook, so at this point I was feeling that the pencil was a little more scratchy than I was used to, so I decided to just put another sheet of paper underneath what I was working on. In fact, this being the last page of my sketchbook, there will be a sketchbook tour coming very, very soon. With that, my preparatory drawings are done, and now I'm going to show you the materials that I ended up using for this spread, and some of those that I will be using in the upcoming final pieces that I'm going to show you how I made. All my materials always start out neatly and nicely arranged so that I can see the entire color range. All the colors are kind of sorted together, but as I work, I just keep chucking down pencils here and there, so it takes me a little while to kind of sort them back into the positions that they ought to be in so that I can swatch it properly and figure out the darks, lights, the medium tones, and then put all the peaches and the grays and everything together as they should be. I've also made a selection of a few brushes that I decided to use, and I have refreshed my gouache palette and added in the colors that I need to use for the final pieces in there as fresh paint. Typically when you're doing these things, I completely forgot to press record when I was doing the actual swatches, but I can show you the actual tools I was using. This is the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist's Pen in white, the Museum Aquarelle from Caran in white again. This is a blender pen from Tombow, and the permanent white from Winsor & Newton Designer Gouache. Those are the mixing shades and the lightest highlight tones. Then we move on to the peaches, for which we have Winsor & Newton Designer Gouache Flesh Tint, not a title I'm fond of. Then we have the Burnt Sienna from Caran Luminance Pencils number 866. It's really one of my favorite colors and I have been using it a lot lately, not just in the limited palette. Then we have the Tombow number 772, 912 and also 942. I've also got a Liquitex paint pen in light pink as well as a Posca beige pen. I didn't actually use the brightest pink or the Liquitex in this, but they do fit within this color palette. The brown gouache I used was Schminke Horror-Dame in Van Dyke Brown, one of my absolute favorite mainstays. Then we've got a dark brown Posca pen, and this really works well in any of these three paintings. I could use this as the darkest shade. The Tombows that I use for this are this beautiful N57, which is kind of like a grey-green shade, and then an N45, which is a definite blue-grey, and an N15, which is a very dark grey. Now that's probably closer to black than to grey, so I haven't actually used it in the sketches. Posca Indigo and the Polychromos Indigo both read as a darker shade of whatever color they used on top of. And then we've got this Caran Pablo Sepia and a Holbein Sepia as well. Again, I didn't use the blues in the sketches, but I will be using them in the final pieces, mainly to add depth in preference to using black. Now moving over into the set of greens, I have this lovely Posca khaki green. I use this pen a lot. It's a very, very versatile color. Then we have Tombow number 228, number 098, and number 177. And that is those three swatches down there and that pen. Now this one is a gouache paint, which is olive green by Winsor & Newton. Again, very versatile. And then the pencils are this Caran Pablo olive black and two dark greens, number 7 and 77 from Posca Pencils, which are those. The brushes I'm using are a liner brush, an angle shader, a small round brush and a square brush, all of which are mentioned previously in my brushes video, I think, so go check that out. The paper I'll be using is this CasArt own brand 300 GSM watercolor paper, and it's hot pressed and smooth. I usually use cold press, but I really wanted to try this one and it's really nice and thick, so we're going to go with this. I'm going to use one A4 sheet and two A5s because I'll cut it in half. Starting Originals begins the same way as sketches do, with a rough layout. However, it takes much longer for me to work in gouache than it does with markers. There's drying time, I want to be a little bit tidier, I'm blending as well. So I'm not going to make you sit through the entirety of it. I am going to edit it down into little snippets so you can see what I do. I start off with the base layer of gouache, making sure my shapes are well defined using my angle shader brush, which gives me a nice flat brush as well as good points. Then I'm adding in a little bit of shading at this point using that Van Dyke brown. I realized I don't actually have a really dark grey in my gouache collection, and I did not want to mix it with black and make this all muddy. So I mixed that Van Dyke brown with a little bit of the green to give it a certain tone. Once that's done, I will set aside this piece to dry and start work on the next one. For this, the base tone is Van Dyke Brown mixed with a little bit of that olive green, giving it a slightly greener grayish rather than completely brown tone. I'm shading it with the peach mixed with a little bit of white to give a roundness to the tomatoes. Gouache is always a little bit harder to blend than watercolors or even acrylics, but I find that putting the lighter color on top and then using a slightly damp brush to kind of wash it into the background color works well for me. Darker colors tend to dry a bit lighter and lighter colors tend to dry a little bit darker depending on the color. So when you're actually mixing colors, do a test swatch to make sure that it's going to end up being the color you actually want. By the time I finish this third piece, that first peach piece will be ready to work on again. The gouache will have dried enough so that it doesn't lift off when I do the next layer on top of it. Here I'm using that Van Dyke Brown mixed with olive green for the stems of the tomatoes, whereas in my layout I did use a green with the peach, didn't I? So you can chop and change and decide what you want to do when you're doing the final piece based on the experiments that you've done in your sketchbook. I'm using here a really thin liner brush because I want to be very precise in the way that I make these pieces. Always in the back of my mind is 1, creating contrast, 2, reducing that contrast but still having a pleasing picture, as in the case of these darker tomatoes. Remember, I'm not trying to do a realistic tomato, I'm trying to do an illustrative one. This is just my brain breaking down those reference pictures that I took into a form that I think is pleasing. That's basically what art is, remixing what you see according to your own brain chemistry and representing it in whatever form you wish. But then art is also so subjective that if you're watching this video, you might actually have preferred my sketches as opposed to the final finished piece, whereas others who watch this may think, oh, the finished pieces are so much better than the original loose work in the sketchbook. It's really, really personal, and I don't think anybody can decide what is good art, what is not, based on just what they think. Adding the highlights is always fun for me because that's when my piece sort of starts to come alive, I feel, and I start to get an idea of what the finished bit might look like, and it also gives me an idea of where to put my pencils, where to add texture, where to add dimension, and it's all kind of dictated by those little highlights. Adding the petals or the leaves for these, I tend to go very precise, but in this case I used smaller leaves on some of the tomatoes and much larger ones on the others. Sometimes when I'm trying to explain my work, I find it really difficult to justify why I made certain decisions because I'm literally making them as I'm painting. I'm not thinking about why I'm doing something, I'm just doing it because it feels right, because the piece calls for it, or I just want to. And that's what happened in the case of the mid-green tomatoes. I somehow felt like the leaves on this one needed to be a little bit more, I don't know, audacious, a little bit more character, a little bit more personality, a bit more wavy. I was stopped a little bit by my Posca pen leaking halfway through, but I managed to save it. It did not destroy my painting. When accidents like this happen, it's much easier to sort them out in gouache than something like watercolor, which is so translucent. I do find making originals a very mindful process because I have to go slower than I normally do in my sketchbook, and sometimes my brain tends to work faster than my hands can. So I need to slow down, think about it, make precise decisions, and that really helps because you can clear your mind of all the chatter that's going on in it. Take out all the endless lists and all the housework and all the work and everything, and just concentrate on what you're doing. As a finishing touch, I decided to add some shadows to this green tomato piece. I used the Posca Indigo Blue, and although I'm adding another color here, when you put it close to the green, it does read more gray rather than pure blue. A few more highlights to the petals or the leaves with that white pencil just pushes everything else into the background a little more, brings a tiny bit more contrast where I think it needs it. I haven't quite decided whether I'm going to put that shadow in the two smaller pieces, so I've left them without one for now. I kind of like them as is. So here's a more detailed look at the finished pieces. You can see that even though they're in a limited palette, they have a little charm all of their own. It's pretty clear that they're tomatoes even though they're not realistic colors, and I really like the combination of browny greeny grey with the green and the peach in the lighter one. I'm wondering whether I should have put all three colors on the same vine and made it even more abstract, because you could have different levels of tomato ripeness on the same vine. Perhaps I'll do a piece like that. The journey from sketchbook to finished piece takes a long time. Sometimes you draw in your sketchbook and then you never finish the pieces until much later. I hope you enjoyed this video. Go watch my watercolor pencils one next if you want to see more original artwork. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!